Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the Black Widow situation, and we're going to intertwine that into the Space Jam situation. So Space Jam is getting absolutely annihilated on Rotten Tomatoes for the critics. They hate it. They hate the movie. Now, I haven't seen Space Jam. I'm not planning on seeing it because I hate LeBron. I can't stand LeBron James. I think LeBron James is a garbage person. I think he's a garbage human being. I think he's a great basketball player, but I think he's completely ignorant and stupid when it comes to literally anything outside of basketball. Every time this man says anything about politics or police officers or social things, the man is just dumb as a fucking rock. He just is. LeBron James is a very, very stupid person. Okay? That is who LeBron James is. But he's also a big star because he is one of the greatest basketball players of all time. You can't deny his greatness on the court. I never have and I never will. Well, Space Jam, the box office numbers for Space Jam are in as well. And we're going to talk about that. But the bigger thing I wanted to focus on is Black Widow, because Black Widow dropped 80% at the box office in week 2. So first things first, Space Jam 2 streaks past Black Widow. The family sequel starring basketball great LeBron James is expected to score $32 million plus in its domestic debut for an easy win at the box office. Now, let's talk about that for just a moment. I think what we're starting to see here, in my opinion, I think what we're starting to see is that people are really wanting to get out of the house. And I think that plays a lot into Black Widow's huge opening weekend because people are just ready to get back into the groove. People missed going to the cinema, as I did, as many of you did. People are just really ready to get back into the cinema. And so, LeBron James has a huge social media presence and he's a big star. Number 1 jersey in the NBA sells. So, I mean, this number's not totally surprising to me at all. But what's really crazy to me is that Black Widow fell 80%. Black Widow dropped 80% for an MCU movie. 80% is a massive drop. Massive. Now, again, I gave Black Widow credit for its big opening weekend. Okay? Gave it credit. And I will continue to give it credit for that big opening weekend. But just as I gave it credit for a big opening weekend, I will absolutely highlight that it dropped 80% in week 2. What does that tell us? That tells us that word of mouth was not strong for Black Widow. That tells us that word of mouth was really, really bad. That tells us that people went to see this movie because why? Because they were interested in the movie. And they walked out of it and they didn't tell other people to go see the movie. They told other people that this movie was not worth going to see. Now, were those people intimidated by strong women? The people that paid to go see it opening weekend and then walked out of it and then decided it's not a good movie. Were they intimidated by strong women? If that's the case, then why did they pay to go see the movie in the first place? Or maybe it's just not a good movie. Maybe it's a bad movie because it is a bad movie. You can like it and that's okay. But it's still a bad movie. Black Widow was not good. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen, but it's definitely not a good movie. And clearly the people that went to see this movie opening weekend walked out of it, and now they're saying it's not a good movie because it's not a good movie. And the numbers are starting to show that now. 80% in week 2 might be the biggest drop for any MCU movie. I don't know if you guys can look that up to see what the biggest second week drop for an MCU movie was, but I would love to know if Black Widow has now set that record. I'm thinking about big drops for MCU movies, maybe Thor: The Dark World, since that was such a bad movie, maybe. But I don't know. I don't know if Thor: The Dark World would have gotten that big of a drop. 80% has to be about as high as we've ever seen of a drop for an MCU movie, in my opinion. Now, again, that's just the reality of where we are. Space Jam has a good opening weekend, a very solid opening weekend. All right. Black Widow had a very solid opening weekend previously. Now, what does this tell us? I think this tells us that I think this tells us that people are really ready to get back into the groove of living their lives normally after the lockdown and the pandemic and everything like that. People want to get back into movie theaters. I think that we saw that with Black Widow, and we're seeing that with Space Jam. That's fine. That makes total sense. No issues there. But now you're seeing the effect of the quality of the movie, and people clearly did not walk away with a good opinion of Black Widow, because if not, then people would have really told all of their friends and family, hey, Black Widow's amazing, go check it out. But I firmly believe that this is simply a situation where people are tired of sitting around in their houses. And again, a lot of people, myself included, like I've gotten to a point where when it comes to going to theaters, I hate people because they can't stop talking. They can't stay off their phones. They can't stop yapping, and they kind of ruin the experience of going to the cinema. But even me, as someone who hasn't really enjoyed that experience in recent years, after the pandemic, after the lockdown, the thought of not being able to go to the movies again was a very sad reality to think about. So now that the movies are back in the fold, I think people are just dying to get out of their house. They're dying to get out of their house, and they're dying to go and see whatever's available. Black Widow was a success. Now it's dropped 80% in week 2, meaning the audience that paid to see it, the audience that paid to see a strong woman in a movie perform as an action star, walked away and said, this movie is not good. Don't go see it. And so now other people are deciding, yeah, it's not really worth it. It's not really worth it, because you would think week 2, after the pandemic and everything, you would think week 2 might be even a little bit stronger, considering a lot of people were like, okay, I don't want to go when the movie is packed, so I'm going to wait for week 2. Well, now they're not even going in week 2. So that tells you that the word of mouth was not very strong. That's where we are. Space Jam has had a good opening weekend, but again, I think week 2 is going to be the true test for Space Jam, as it is most movies. Because why? Because what happens? Okay, Force Awakens, record-breaking opening weekend, okay? Second week, it only had like a 37, I think, % drop, which is unbelievably great. Like, unbelievably great. I think it was 37, 39. I can't remember exactly. The Last Jedi had like a mid-60s, like 65% drop in week 2. How do you go from high 30s to mid-60s with a very, very bad movie? People walked out of The Force Awakens and they enjoyed what they saw. People walked out of The Last Jedi and they hated what they saw. And that's how you got a mid-60s drop in week 2 for The Last Jedi. Because that's where the true test of the legs of a movie is going to show. If you have an 80% drop in week 2, that tells you that the audience that went to see it in opening weekend was not excited, and there was no enthusiasm after the movie released and after audiences got to watch it. So that's where we are. We'll see what happens with Space Jam. But it's I just, LeBron obviously has such a massive following, so there's going to be a lot of people that are going to go out and see it just out of sheer curiosity. But now we'll see in week 2 what it really, really does.